This is a Pacific tree frog, and this is its scientific classification, categorization to individual taxonomic ranks in hierarchical order. The study that focuses on classification of living organisms and their relationships among each other is called taxonomy. And the terms connected to taxonomy, along with the whole idea of this big classification scheme, might seem difficult and overwhelming. But we humans have a tendency to try to make sense of the world around us and to simplify it. So the process of organizing the living world into groups is in fact more natural than you might think. Here, look at these organisms. Without necessarily knowing exactly what they are, we can look at them and group them just by their appearance. Maybe we can divide them into two groups: those that have eyes and mouth parts and those that don't. Then, if we look at the first group, we see that some organisms look more similar to each other than the others, such as these two that both have wings. Maybe we could create a subgroup from them. And now look at the second group. Even though these two organisms both have flowers, they look somewhat different. And some of you might even kick out this third organism out of the group completely, as it doesn't quite fit here. But it doesn't fit the first group either. Maybe it needs its own group? This process of comparing visible characteristics of the individual organisms and, based on their similarities and differences, arranging them into groups, is really how the concept of classification started. And appearance is just one of the criteria we can consider when creating these groups. The first documented attempts at using systematic methods of careful observation to describe, compare, and categorize organisms come from Aristotle. He focused on zoology, particularly but not exclusively on marine organisms. He put together information about individual animals and their behavior, morphology, reproduction, diet, and other important observations. His findings are captured in multiple books he wrote, the most famous one probably being History of Animals. You can find translations of these books both online and in the physical form, and I highly recommend at least browsing through them. Aristotle's primary goal wasn't to organize all the living world, but some level of classification and ranking of the organisms naturally came out of his identification of similarities and differences he noticed in the animals' features and behaviors. Even though Aristotle's work was based on scientific methods, it was later taken as the basis for a philosophical religious concept called scala naturae, or the great chain of being, popular especially during Neoplatonism and in the Middle Ages. Under this concept, all the matter on Earth, including living creatures such as humans and non-living objects such as rocks, are placed into a linear sequence from the most primitive, spiritless objects such as minerals, through trees and animals, all the way to the highest positions with the most advanced creatures like angels and the perfect God on the very top. The idea of this great chain of being was accepted in society for centuries. Even though many philosophers and scientists have tried to create order in the natural world after Aristotle's significant contributions, the first attempt to systematically organize all living organisms didn't come until Carl Linnaeus. He is considered to be the father of taxonomy, and he laid the foundation for the modern classification system, even though the system has changed significantly since his time. Despite that, the term Linnaean classification or Linnaean taxonomy is widely used nowadays. He also came up with binomial naming of organisms, but I will talk about this in a different video, as that's a big and very important topic. All you need to know for now is that the standardized two-word Latin naming of species, as we know it today, started at this time. Linnaeus' hierarchical categorization system is based on visible structures and characteristics. He divided organisms into three kingdoms: the animal, the vegetable, and the mineral kingdom. Yes, Linnaeus even included minerals in his classification, but we don't include them in our current biological classification. A kingdom is the taxon with the highest rank. You can think of it as the most general division of organisms. Further, he divided each kingdom into classes, again based on their differences and similarities. The classes were then divided into orders, orders into genera, and genera into species, so that a species is the most specific classification. He introduced his classification concept in the famous Systema Naturae. The book was revised 12 times during Linnaeus' lifetime, as he continued developing and reworking the classification system. But as I already mentioned, Linnaean classification went through many changes since its original form. That's mainly thanks to the new scientific methods that became available over time, such as DNA sequencing and the use of molecular biology in general, and with the emphasis on evolutionary relationships. There are no clear and definite criteria for each of the ranks. Assigning individual organisms or groups to particular higher taxa is based on many factors, some of which might change over time, such as with new findings through genetic work. So keep this in mind when I introduce you to the taxonomic ranks we recognize nowadays. Domain is the highest and a relatively new taxonomic rank, introduced in 1990, just 33 years ago. Before the domain, there was an empire, and the organisms were divided into two empire or two superkingdom system, splitting them into eukaryotes and prokaryotes based on the type of cells that make them up. With the use of molecular biology and a focus on evolutionary relationships, Carl Linnaeus introduced the third group, Archaebacteria, and after many years of being challenged, the three-domain system came to exist. So today, we recognize three domains: Archaea, Bacteria, and Eukarya. Is it an animal or a plant? That's how it all started. Then, remember, there was Linnaeus and his animal kingdom and vegetable kingdom, and even mineral kingdom. That was still pretty straightforward. Today, the division is a little more complicated, and scientists cannot even really agree on how many kingdoms there are. This is because the division is no longer based only on visible characters, but with the advances in our knowledge and the use of genetics, we want each individual group to be so-called natural, having a single common ancestor. And that results in some disagreement. While the majority of current resources recognize 6 kingdoms of life, you might come across 7 or 5 kingdom systems. Organisms are divided into individual phyla based on shared characteristics or evolutionary relationships, and at this level, many of them focus on anatomical features or body plan. In our example, we have the phylum Arthropoda, which means jointed leg, referring to their jointed limbs, which is characteristic for this phylum. In botany, the term division is often used in place of phylum. Class is the next taxonomic rank, and for our beetle, it would be class Insecta. This particular class was already introduced by Carl Linnaeus, as you can see in this text from the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. Continuing down in the hierarchy, we get to order. Although it is used for all living organisms, you might be most familiar with animal orders. You all have probably heard of rodents, order Rodentia, primates, which is an order that humans belong to, or Coleoptera, like in our example, which comprises beetles. Family is a taxonomic rank that's commonly used as the entry level when learning how to identify organisms, so you might be familiar with this term. With many, but not all organisms, we can really start seeing the morphological similarities amongst individuals belonging to one family just by their appearance. Remember, I create a video series How to Identify Plants, where I teach you how to recognize plant families based on shared characteristics. I'll put the link to the series in the description below. Family names have a fixed ending, which is useful to know as you can easily recognize the rank from the name alone. In zoology, it is the suffix -ed, like in our example of Cerambicidae. In botany, we use the suffix "ac", like in Fabaceae, Asteraceae, Myrtaceae, Rubiaceae, etc. The size of genera varies greatly, and while some genera include only one species, there are genera that have hundreds or even thousands of species. The genus name appears as the first word in the binomial naming system. Species is the smallest and the most specific rank normally used. Each species is given a binomial name, consisting of a genus name, which is the first word, and a species name, which is the second word. There are other intermediate categories or subcategories often used, for example subspecies, tribe, subphylum, or superfamily. They're not used for all organisms, but in most cases, you can clearly tell from the name where in the hierarchy they're positioned. Have you ever come across these taxonomic ranks? And if so, what were they? Let me know in the comments below. I hope this video was helpful for you, and the concept of classification is now more understandable to you. If that's the case, please leave me a comment or like this video to support my work. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.